What if 2026 becomes the year everything we assumed was stable starts to fray at the edges? 10 predictions, some whispered by century-old seers, some shouted by modern mediums, others pieced together by interpreters of culture and data, are circling online, and together they paint a picture that is equal parts unsettling and eerily plausible. In this countdown you'll hear names that feel ancient and names that feel like headlines. Craig Hamilton Parker, Baba Vanga, a puzzling reference sometimes written as Edgar Cayce, Nostradamus, even a throwaway joke on The Simpsons that suddenly looks less like satire and more like a cultural nudge. We'll balance the eerie claims with scientific context and historical analogues, because sensation without grounding becomes only noise. If you love unsettling reveals like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. 10. Sanitary shock, a new outbreak that rattles the world, attributed to Craig Hamilton Parker. Some readings circulating online say a fresh sanitary crisis will jolt societies in 2026. The language attached to these claims tends to be dramatic. Talk of a pathogen that spreads fast, disrupts travel and commerce, and forces governments into reactive mode. The images people imagine are immediate. Hospitals filling again, supply chains wobbling, public gatherings curtailed. But there are important distinctions to make. Interpreters who cite Craig Hamilton Parker emphasize that this isn't necessarily COVID redux in the sense of an identical virus and trajectory. They frame it as a novel shock to systems already frayed by recent global health events, an event that exposes how interconnected and therefore vulnerable our supply chains, logistics, and social systems are. Scientists have long warned about zoonotic spillover, the basic idea that viruses jump from animals to humans, as a constant background risk, especially where habitat loss, industrial farming, and global travel intersect. Public health authorities regularly tell us the timing and nature of any future outbreak are unpredictable. Imagine a city where a single fast-moving respiratory illness forces workplace closures for weeks. Not every municipality collapses, not every country panics, but the ripple effects, delays in shipping, temporary shortages, overloaded emergency rooms, are what make such a scenario disruptive, especially when layered on top of other stresses like extreme weather or power interruptions. Responsible preparation is not about hoarding, it's about thinking structurally. Resilient supply chains, strong public health infrastructure, transparent communication. In short, the prophetic language speaks to vulnerability more than to biological certainty. And if this feels ominous, remember the caveat. The claim is attributed to a medium and remains interpretive. Scientists say we should be vigilant, but they don't predict prophecies. They monitor pathogens, model spread, and advise on mitigations. 9. Solar blackout. The sun lashes out and modern life goes dim, linked in some readings to Craig Hamilton Parker and amplified by online interpreters. Close your eyes for a second and picture waking up with every screen dark. No alerts, no traffic apps, no scrolling feed. The lights in many neighborhoods still glow from local grids, but banks, satellites, air traffic systems, and internet backbones are struggling. That is the cinematic image these warnings use, a coronal mass ejection, an enormous bubble of magnetized plasma hurled from the sun toward Earth, striking our satellites and power grids. This is where myth meets measured science. The sun flips through cycles of activity, roughly every 11 years. Some parts of the internet are already awash with comparisons to the Carrington event of 1859, the historical benchmark for geomagnetic storm intensity. The Carrington storm knocked out telegraph networks and painted auroras around the planet. If a similar event struck today, its effects would be magnified by our dependency on electronics and high-voltage transmission. Researchers at space agencies and universities monitor solar activity closely. Space weather forecasting has improved. Satellites and ground arrays watch sunspots and eruptions, and operators can sometimes take satellites into safe modes or reroute power temporarily. But the vulnerability remains real. A severe geomagnetic storm can induce currents in long transmission lines, potentially damaging transformers and leading to prolonged outages. Historic analogues exist. More recent events, smaller than Carrington, have already caused measurable disruptions. Quebec experienced a massive blackout in 1989, caused by a geomagnetic disturbance that knocked out power for millions for hours. Still, it's crucial to separate dramatic prophecy from measured risk assessment. Space scientists say a repeat of Carrington-level damage is rare, but not impossible. They emphasize preparedness and infrastructure hardening rather than fatalism. The prophetic angle uses the image of sudden tech darkness to make a point about fragility. Our systems amplify a single natural shock into cascading social effects. If you imagine airports grounded, stock exchanges flickering, and hospitals shifting into contingency power, the psychological reality is as important as the physical one. 8. The Earth responds, intensified natural disasters, and a planet that feels like it's pushing back, attributed in some readings to Baba Vanga. Stories attributed to the Bulgarian seer Baba Vanga often come wrapped in poetic certainty. Visions of seas rising, lands shaking, storms growing in fury. In popular retellings, these get reshaped into short headlines. Baba Vanga predicted giant storms. But the more careful interpreters frame the claim as a theme rather than a strict timetable, intensification of natural hazards as a consequence of cumulative environmental stress. That theme resonates when you place it beside modern records. Floods are setting new benchmarks in many regions. Heat waves that used to be once in a century now arrive more frequently. Wildfires burn with an intensity previously rare in the recorded climate era. Scientists attribute much of this trend to anthropogenic climate change. Higher average temperatures load the atmosphere with more moisture. Melting ice changes ocean circulations. Altered precipitation patterns stress ecosystems and built environments. The prophetic reading and the scientific reality intersect at the level of consequence. Whether one views Baba Vanga's words as literal foresight or symbolic warnings, the lived examples are clear. Communities repeatedly hit by compound disasters, an earthquake followed by a storm, or prolonged drought leading to failing agriculture and human displacement, face cascading breakdowns in governance and social cohesion. The human angle matters. Losing a harvest, watching local infrastructure erode, or fleeing one's home shapes politics, economies, and social trust. At the same time, scientists and emergency managers emphasize adaptation, building codes, floodplain management, early warning systems, and community resilience. Those measures won't eliminate disaster, but they can change outcomes. Prophecy in this reading is a spotlight on vulnerability. Modern risk science is a toolkit for response. 7. Maps redrawn. Geological shifts and sudden changes in coastlines, linked to Edgar Cayce readings in some archives. One of the more classical prophetic motifs, attributed in parts of the online archive to a figure sometimes transcribed as Edgar Cayce, describes major changes to landmasses, coastlines slipping, islands appearing or sinking, and new waterways redrawing maps. Readers who bring Edgar Cayce to mind see echoes of his long-winded trances about submerged lands and shifting continents, though the transcription issues in modern retellings create uncertainty about exact wording, hence the sporadic label Edgar Cayce that appears in some sources. From a geological perspective, dramatic map changes in a single year are rare, but not impossible on a local scale. Subduction earthquakes can cause coastal uplift or subsidence. Tsunamis can reshape shorelines. Tectonic processes are slow on human timescales, but when energy is suddenly released, an earthquake, a landslide into a fjord, the shoreline can appear to change overnight. The Ring of Fire around the Pacific is a belt of tectonic activity. It hosts much of the planet's seismic drama. Sea level rise, meanwhile, steadily eats away at low-lying coasts, reshaping habitats over decades rather than days. If you thread prophecy through geology, the claim becomes less a literal overnight remapping and more an alarm about fragile places and underprepared infrastructure. The human story here is displacement and adaptation, ports disrupted, fishing communities forced to migrate, insurance markets recalculating risk. A sober counterpoint, geologists will tell you that most continental scale changes unfold over centuries, but sudden local alterations, an uplifted shoreline after an earthquake, a bay widened by erosion, do occur and can be devastating for people who live there. Again, the prophetic voice signals vulnerability. Science gives the mechanisms and probabilities. If those 4 items already feel heavy, brace yourself, there's more. But first, pause and think. What do you do when the maps you rely on stop matching the ground beneath your feet? If this material is gripping you, subscribe now. There's more ahead. Faster, stranger, and in some cases eerier. So stick with me. For those wondering whether any of this has precedent, a few explainer stories are worth holding in mind. The Carrington benchmark. What the 1859 solar storm teaches us about rare but consequential events. Back in 1859, a British astronomer named Richard Carrington observed an enormous white flare on the sun. Hours later, telegraph systems around the world failed. Some operators reported shocks, and auroras lit skies as far south as the Caribbean. That event is the baseline used by space weather scientists when they speak of a Carrington-class storm. The mechanisms are straightforward in outline. A massive coronal mass ejection, CME, hurls charged particles and magnetic fields into space. When that cloud encounters Earth's magnetic field, it induces currents in long conductors on the surface. Think telegraph wires in the 19th century. Long electrical grids today. Why does that history matter? Because it shows a rare single natural occurrence can cascade through infrastructure dependent on electricity and electromagnetics. Today's grid relies on transformers and long transmission lines that are more susceptible to geomagnetically induced currents than telegraph networks were. The scientific community continuously monitors the sun. Satellites like those run by national space agencies, ground magnetometer arrays, and models that estimate the arrival and impact of solar storms. Some utilities incorporate geomagnetic storm risk into planning. Others remain more exposed. The Quebec episode of 1989 is a modern cautionary tale. A geomagnetic disturbance triggered a blackout that left millions without power for hours. It's not a prophecy. It's a historical proof of concept, a data point that shows how technological systems can be sensitive to space weather. That's why many of the prophetic warnings about solar blackouts intersect with real scientific vulnerabilities, albeit filtered through language that often imprints certainty onto low-probability, high-impact scenarios. Quebec, 1989. When geomagnetism met the grid, in March of 1989, a relatively modest geomagnetic storm induced currents that traveled through Hydro-Quebec's power system, tripping protective relays and leaving large regions without electricity for up to 9 hours. The incident is instructive because it demonstrates how modern grids can fail when subjected to a natural phenomenon that interacts with long, conductive infrastructure. Engineers learned from it. Some systems were retrofitted, monitoring improved, and emergency procedures rehearsed. Still, the risk hasn't vanished. It has simply been recognized and managed to varying degrees across different utilities and countries. Solar Cycle 25 and the Language of Probability. We are living through one of the sun's activity cycles. Scientists name these cycles and track sunspots, flares, and associated phenomena. A more active solar cycle raises the statistical likelihood of eruptions and CMEs, but it does not guarantee a Carrington-level event in any given year. Space weather researchers emphasize probabilities, early warnings and mitigation measures, safe mode satellites, hardening critical transformers, updating grid procedures. The prophetic discourse compresses these probabilities into a dramatic narrative. A single year, 2026, becomes the focal point. The responsible way to read it is as a reminder. The risk exists, agencies monitor it, and resilience is a social decision more than a mystical inevitability. 6. Martian exit strategies and the cultural mirror. Simpsons gag meets space-age planning. In the mid-1990s, a Simpsons episode joked about moving humanity to Mars. The gag lives on as a cultural reference to escapist fantasy. Some readers spin that sideways into prophecy. If Earth becomes less hospitable or less safe, migration to Mars will accelerate as an elite exit strategy. The real-world echo is simpler and more mundane. Private companies and national programs are planning missions, short stays, and eventually longer-term habitation experiments. Elon Musk and SpaceX, as a cultural shorthand, get dragged into these narratives because any mention of Mars stirs public imagination about leaving the planet. What do we actually know? Interplanetary migration on any meaningful scale is decades away at minimum. The logistics, life support, radiation shielding, long-term food production, economic sustainability are immense obstacles. Yet the idea of Mars as an insurance policy, an off-world contingency, feeds conspiracy-minded or prophetic framings that see a bifurcated future. Most of humanity remains on Earth, while a small technocratic class escapes to the red dust. There are subtler implications. The talk of Mars exposes a cultural psychology. In moments of anxiety, human imagination goes to two poles, fortifying what we have or fantasizing an exit. That mental divide is important because it shapes policy priorities and public investment. If the prophecy here is an omen of mass migration, interpret it instead as a symptom. We are collectively grappling with the idea that our planet might become less hospitable unless we act. 5. Institutions in turmoil, governments losing control and political fracturing, linked in some readings to Nostradamus. Nostradamus has long served as a repository for projected political chaos in popular retellings. Interpreters who pin Nostradamus to 2026 warnings talk about institutional fragility. Governments overwhelmed by simultaneous pressures, economic stress, unrest, migration, cyber disruptions, and struggling to maintain order. The cinematic image is of streets crowded with protests, communications strained, and state apparatus stretched thin. From a sober perspective, the concept is less mystical and more sociological. Institutions can be stressed by multiple correlated shocks. Economic downturns, infrastructure failures, and political polarization amplify one another. Modern states have reserves and contingency plans, but no system is immune to compound stressors. What's especially destabilizing is not any one failure but the feedback loops. A power outage disrupts financial systems, which disrupts supply chains, which increases unrest, which overwhelms emergency responses. Analysts caution that predicting a collapse is different from identifying vulnerabilities. Democracies and autocracies alike can be resilient in unexpected ways. The prophetic framing serves as a warning about dependencies. When decision-making relies on centralized information flows, an attack on those flows, whether technological, natural, or social, can create cascading uncertainty. The antidote public experts offer is strengthening redundancy, decentralizing certain services, protecting critical infrastructure, and building civic trust that sustains collective action in crises. 4. Europe on edge, regional instability, and the fracturing of alliances, linked by some readers to Nostradamus. Some rereadings of Nostradamus and other prophetic fragments suggest a period of particular tension in Europe. Rather than naming nations or predicting specific battles, these interpretations describe a strain on alliances, sudden political reconfigurations, and migration pressures that test social cohesion. The prophetic language often dramatizes such tensions with evocative metaphors. The sober reading translates those metaphors into real-world stressors, energy supply shocks, economic ripples, and rapid political shifts. Why does Europe appear in these narratives? Europe is a dense knot of interdependent economies, energy interconnections, and complex political institutions, the European Union, NATO partners, and a patchwork of national governments. A shock that affects one node, say a major cyber attack on a central bank or a severe energy disruption, can produce cross-border effects. At the micro level, the human impact is clear. Communities facing sudden unemployment, migrants arriving in larger numbers than local frameworks planned for, political parties exploiting fear and scarcity. Importantly, scholars caution against reading prophecy as deterministic. History shows moments of strain that led either to cooperation or fragmentation. The margin between the two often depends on leadership, civic resilience, and the ability of institutions to absorb shock without delegitimizing themselves. The prophetic claim reads as a red flag. The sensible response is to identify leverage points where cooperation averts worst-case spirals. Practical interlude. If city systems creak, what non-alarmist steps can households take? Before we move deeper into the countdown, a short, practical pause. The solar and infrastructure issues we've discussed are about systemic fragility, not about speculative doom. There are modest, common-sense measures households can take that reduce stress without feeding panic or profiteering. First, information backups. Keep local copies of important documents and phone numbers offline, paper copies or encrypted files on a USB drive stored away from your main devices. Second, basic power resilience. A small phone power bank, a charged laptop with an offline copy of essential files, and a solar charging panel for small electronics can keep communications open for critical periods. Third, community networks. Knowing your neighbors and local emergency plans often matters more than any gadget. Mutual aid is a resilience multiplier. Fourth, water and food. A short-term supply, enough for several days, is reasonable, not hoarding. Fifth, keep apps and devices updated where possible and understand how to access emergency broadcast stations. Battery-powered radios are still useful. Note the boundaries. None of this promises invulnerability. These are ways to reduce discomfort and maintain situational awareness during temporary outages. They are practical, not prophetic. The countdown continues and the stakes rise. The next items move from climate and geology into technology, perception, and the most speculative fringes of cultural prophecy. Before we head into the territory where myth and modernity blur, take a breath and imagine the cumulative picture. A sanitary surprise, a solar lash, tectonic rearrangements, political strain. Each on its own is destabilizing. Together, they form an overlapping set of stressors that test our systems and our narratives. It's time to fasten the next layer of tension: corporate technology, cosmic claims, and the rediscovery stories that sit at the heart of human fascination. We'll pick up with a shift from outward, physical shocks to the invisible infrastructures that run our lives, and the ideas that could upend what we consider possible. 3. Algorithmic drift. AI decision-making spins beyond control, a modern warning with scientific context. One of the most recurring modern anxieties is that algorithms, once mundane tools, will begin to steer crucial decisions in ways humans don't understand. Prophetic interpretations of this scenario aren't ancient. They're contemporary, emerging from fears about opacity and scale. Analysts point to algorithmic opacity, systems whose inner workings are opaque to users and even to their designers, as the core risk. In practice, this takes forms we can describe concretely. Automated trading systems that cascade erratic trades, content recommendation engines that amplify polarizing narratives, and decision support tools in healthcare or criminal justice that embed bias. The technology here isn't a robot uprising from science fiction. It's about dependency on opaque systems whose failure modes are poorly understood. A model trained on biased or incomplete data can reproduce and amplify that bias at scale. A seemingly small bug in a coordination protocol can cascade into large-scale outages. Experts, computer scientists, ethicists, and regulators argue for transparency, auditability, and human oversight. The prophetic framings that speak of AI out of control often condense these concerns into shorthand, creating an emotionally resonant image. The responsible conversation reframes the issue. How do we design and govern complex automated systems so that human values guide outcomes? 2. The sky opens, a public moment of perceived extraterrestrial contact, tied in some sources to Baba Vanga and recent public interest. In several popular retellings, Baba Vanga is associated with visions of beings or unusual skies. Contemporary interpreters often link such claims to recent government disclosures about unidentified aerial phenomena and to high-profile accounts by former military personnel. The narrative goes like this: something in the sky prompts a sudden reassessment, official statements, viral footage, and a public debate that divides populations over interpretation and meaning. Context is vital. Declassified reports and congressional briefings in recent years have normalized public curiosity about unexplained observations. Scientists note that many sightings have prosaic explanations, sensor anomalies, classified aircraft, or atmospheric phenomena, but some remain unresolved. A genuine, incontrovertible contact event would be transformational. A surge in ambiguous sightings and official opacity can already shift public perception and political priorities. A prophetic reading here functions as a thought experiment. How would societies respond to evidence that challenges long-standing assumptions? The human ramifications, religious, political, psychological, could be profound even if the event isn't cosmic contact in the cinematic sense. Skeptics caution that ambiguous evidence often breeds exaggerated narratives. Analysts recommend transparency from institutions and careful scientific inquiry to avoid panic or conspiracy. Whilst the Atlantis threshold, rediscovered ancient technology, and the idea of a paradigm shift, framed in some circles as an Edgar Cayce-style revelation, at the top of many lists is the most fantastical claim, that remnants of a lost civilization, labeled by some as Atlantis, will resurface and reveal technologies or energy principles that upend modern understanding. Interpreters often trace this motif to Edgar Cayce-like texts, where mentions of sunken lands and ancient knowledge recur. In modern online retellings, these ideas coalesce into sensational headlines about Atlantean tech or ancient power sources. This is where prophecy and myth collide with longing. The appeal of a hidden technology that could solve pressing dilemmas, clean energy, limitless power, or forgotten engineering, speaks to a profound wish that crises might be resolved by discovery rather than sacrifice. It also raises complex epistemic issues. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Archaeologists, historians, and geophysicists demand rigorous proof before rewriting narratives about civilization and technology. Still, even treated as metaphor, the Atlantis story is potent. It symbolizes a yearning for revelation after a period of anxiety, the hope that beneath the waves or within the dust lie answers that change how we live. Whether one reads these prophecies as literal forecasts or as cultural dreams, they function as a pivot. Crisis can be terrifying, but it can also trigger reinvention. At this crescendo, the prophetic list turns inward. Which of these scenarios do we fear because they are likely, and which do we fear because they illuminate a hidden fragility in our systems and psyches? The answers are messy. The seers and the scientists speak different languages. One offers symbolic urgency, the other offers contingency planning. Both, in their own ways, demand attention. We've reached a point where the narrative tangle tightens. Geological warnings, solar risk, sanitary threats, technological dependency, cosmic questions, and mythic revelations all point to one shared fact. The modern world is a dense web of interdependencies. When one thread frays, the stress redistributes, often in unpredictable ways. Pause here and consider the human picture. If multiple small shocks occur in close succession, a regional blackout during a heat wave while a political crisis unfolds, and a gripping piece of ambiguous footage circulates on social media, public trust becomes the fragile commodity that governs outcomes. Communities with resilient local networks, transparent leadership, and practiced emergency plans fare far better than those without. We are arriving at the threshold between warning and action. The rest of this countdown goes deeper into the psychological and political fallout of these scenarios. How do institutions react when their authority is questioned? How do communities reorganize when the grid falters? And how do narratives about extraterrestrial or ancient revelations reshape collective priorities? The next segments explore the reply of power systems, the role of rumor and authority in moments of uncertainty, and the choices that determine whether a moment of terror becomes a pivot toward reinvention or a slide into chaos. When the threads start unraveling, how do the knots hold? If several of the scenarios we've just outlined begin to occur, even in attenuated or partial forms, the real test is not only the shock itself, but the systems and stories that respond. Power grids, satellite operators, emergency managers, social media platforms, and everyday neighbors all take turns shaping the aftermath. In many ways, the drama of 2026 if any of these prophecies or risks pressure our world, will be a story about response, which institutions adapt, which narratives dominate, and whether communities find ways to make meaning instead of surrendering to panic. Think about a city-level example. A severe geomagnetic disturbance disrupts high-voltage transformers and knocks out parts of the regional grid. Airlines are rerouted, some hospitals shift to backup generation, and payment terminals fail intermittently. At first, official messaging is calm and technical. Grid operators report on relay trips and restoration timelines. Aviation authorities ground certain flights preemptively. But information gaps are inevitable. When the lights stay off for hours, rumors spread. An unverified video claims a nation-state cyber attack coincided with the storm. A forwarded voice note warns that hospitals lack fuel. Within 2 days, local supply chains strain, social media amplifies anecdotal shortages, and some vendors opportunistically hike prices. That cascade, natural event into technical failure into rumor into social stress, is the pattern the prophets compress into a sentence, and the engineers, scientists, and civic leaders try to prevent with contingency plans. The lesson: technical hardening buys time, but trust and clear communication determine whether social cohesion holds. Institutions matter. Utilities and space agencies already operate with contingency protocols designed for rare, high-impact events. Satellite operators can place assets into safe modes when a powerful CME is expected. Grid operators rehearse transformer replacement plans. Hospitals maintain fuel contracts for backup generators. Space weather monitoring, as we noted earlier, is a real-world mitigation tool. Satellites, magnetometers, and international forecasting networks offer lead time in many cases. Yet not every region has equal preparedness. Geographic variation in infrastructure resilience creates uneven exposure. A Carrington-level event might be survivable in a country with redundancies and spare transformer inventories, but more damaging where spares aren't stocked or where long-distance grids are more vulnerable. The social dimension is messier. Authority is partly technical but mostly narrative. In moments of ambiguity, people default to stories that make sense of chaos: conspiracy, prophecy, official explanation, or local rumor. That's why the prophetic voice is potent. It offers an interpretive frame. If a seer's warning is already circulating when an outage occurs, some audiences will connect the two and see confirmation. Others will treat the coincidence as coincidence. The psychological effect of the prophecy is not to change the physics but to tilt perception. A prophetic frame can turn an outage into a portent, and a portent into a movement. This dynamic unfolds with technology in ways that are both subtle and alarming. Consider algorithmic amplification. Social platforms are optimized for engagement. Sensational content travels faster than careful debunking. If a sudden, ambiguous event, an unexplained aerial sighting, a dramatic storm surge, meets an existing online narrative about prophecy or cover-ups, the algorithmic system turbocharges that resonance. That is not an argument against platforms per se. It's an argument for understanding how attention economies interact with fear and meaning-making. The result: a small, local disturbance can feel global and historic within hours if the right narrative hooks are present. We can make that abstract schema concrete by tracking a plausible sequence that stitches together multiple items from our countdown: sanitary surprise, solar event, AI hiccup, and a viral sky video. Imagine a mid-sized country facing a surging respiratory outbreak in isolated communities. Health workers race to contain it, but at the same time a geomagnetic storm triggers communications blips, complicating contact tracing and logistics. A hospital scheduling software, driven by automated optimization, misroutes a shipment because of partial data, and local frustration grows. On the second day, an ambiguous piece of footage circulates on social media, an object in the sky recorded by a dashcam, prompting speculation about extraterrestrial contact. Influencers with large followings connect the dots, calling the series of events signs. The cumulative effect isn't from a single catastrophic failure, but from interlocking glitches and the narratives they spawn. Those are exactly the scenarios analysts worry about when they speak of cascading risk. Policy responses matter at both domestic and international levels. If solar storms present a plausibly elevated risk in any given period, cooperative actions can mitigate impacts. International spare transformer pooling agreements, standardized satellite safe mode protocols, shared situational awareness dashboards, and agreements about prioritizing critical services for power restoration. For epidemics, investment in surveillance networks, lab capacity, and transparent public communication reduce panic. For algorithmic risk, regulatory structures that increase explainability and stress-test critical decision-making software can prevent a single model failure from cascading across markets and public services. None of these are glamorous, they're quiet, institutional labor. Yet over the long arc, they determine whether disruption sharpens inequality or spurs collective problem-solving. The role of the scientific community in this interplay is to translate probabilities into action without lending false certainty to prophecy. We have to accept a dual truth. Low probability, high-impact events can and do occur, and human systems both amplify and attenuate these events. Scientists and engineers can reduce the probability of failure and the magnitude of consequences, but no technical fix eliminates social dynamics. That is why communicators, journalists, public officials, community leaders carry heavy responsibility. Clear, transparent, and timely messaging is not optional. When trust is missing, people turn to other narratives. Sometimes those narratives offer solace, sometimes they amplify harm. Let's shift into a few more illustrative vignettes, small stories that show the human shape of these converging risks. The first is a port city that relies on a handful of cranes and a computerized logistics hub. A regional geomagnetic disturbance overloads monitoring systems and causes intermittent failures in the port's scheduling software. Ship arrivals pile up, time-sensitive cargo spoils, local fishermen and warehouse workers face lost wages. The Port Authority activates manual fallback procedures, paper manifests, radio coordination, but those require trained personnel and time. The economic ripple spreads to trucking firms, small exporters, and finally a retail chain that experiences delays in stocking critical goods. The port's immediate problem is physical hardware and protocols. The broader problem is contingency knowledge and redundancy across the system. A second vignette focuses on a small rural hospital, whose electronic health record system suddenly becomes inaccessible during a widespread connectivity outage. Staff switch to paper charts, but a patient arrives with a complex medication history accessible only through a cloud portal. For hours, clinicians improvise based on interviews and family reports. Later, an after-action review shows that simple measures, a local cached medication list, offline compatible triage forms, and regular drills would have eased the crisis. This is not a call to romanticize analog solutions. It's a reminder that hybrid approaches, digital where advantageous, analog where essential, often constitute the most robust systems. A third vignette tracks public reaction to ambiguous aerial footage. In one town, a viral clip of a strange light over a river unites two groups, those who treat it as atmospheric plasma or a drone test, and those who see it as a sign-booked prophecy. A local pastor organizes a community forum urging calm and critical thinking. A charismatic influencer hosts a live stream that frames the footage as the beginning of contact. The divergence in framing leads to heated exchanges, and in a few cases public disruptions. The key variable in whether the town descends into panic or conversely channels the moment into civic conversation is leadership that privileges evidence and compassion over spectacle. What are reasonable preparations at the household and community levels that do not slip into profiteering or fear-mongering? Practicality matters. Simple, legal, low-cost steps often do as much for resilience as expensive gear. First, community networks, neighbors who can share resources, check on vulnerable residents, and coordinate basic communications reduce stress far more than individual stockpiles. Second, redundancy in communication. A battery-powered radio, knowledge of local emergency frequencies, and a plan for meeting points help if cellular networks falter. Third, financial readiness. Having basic liquidity, small amounts of cash, and copies of essential documents avoids transactional paralysis when card systems struggle. Fourth, digital hygiene. Backing up critical personal data and maintaining offline copies of important contacts and documents reduces dependency on centralized services. None of these suggestions promise safety in every scenario, but they increase capacity to manage disruption without panic. We should also talk about governance and the ethical dilemmas presented by some of the more speculative claims, especially the Atlantean revelation motif. Suppose a credible archaeological discovery surfaced that suggested advanced ancient engineering or previously unknown material science. The questions that would follow are not only technical, but profoundly political and ethical. Who owns the find? Who verifies claims? What are the intellectual property implications if an unusual technology is claimed? How do we prevent extractive behavior or geopolitical competition from ruining the scientific process? The Atlantis story, whether literal or mythic, foregrounds how revelation without stewardship can generate conflict. Responsible institutions, academic, governmental, intergovernmental, need protocols to manage such discoveries transparently and ethically, protecting both scientific integrity and local communities. Similarly, the alien contact scenario, even on the level of ambiguous sightings, raises governance questions. How should states disclose information? How should scientists access data? If a truly unexplained object were confirmed, the political stakes would be enormous. The precautionary principle suggests creating multinational mechanisms now, transparent data sharing frameworks, joint investigative teams, and public communication guidelines, so that if anomalous evidence appears, it can be handled with rigor rather than sensationalism. This is sane, not paranoid. The same logic that produces protocols for asteroid impacts or pandemic reporting applies equally to anomalous aerial phenomena. Turning to the AI item, the real-world policy levers are familiar and actionable. Auditability requirements, impact assessments for systems deployed in critical infrastructure, and mandatory human-in-the-loop rules for high-stakes decisions reduce the chance that an automated process creates cascading harms. Moreover, diversity in design teams and external stress tests that simulate edge-case scenarios can expose brittle behaviors before they leak into public systems. Again, none of these policies eradicate risk. They make it manageable and reduce the odds that an opaque algorithm precipitates a wider crisis. It's worth pausing to name a handful of practical signposts to watch in 2026, signals that would indicate increased risk without asserting inevitability. These are not predictions. They're red flags and data points that analysts use to update probabilities. 1. Unusual clustering of space weather alerts during periods of heightened solar activity, especially if coupled with reports of satellite anomalies. 2. A spike in localized epidemic signals unconnected to well-understood seasonal patterns, particularly in regions with high human-animal interface. 3. Rapid, unexplained market volatility coinciding with mass outages or algorithmic trading anomalies. 4. Sustained, credible reporting from multiple independent sources about anomalous aerial phenomena that resists prosaic explanation. 5. Abrupt archaeological announcements accompanied by claims of revolutionary materials or artifacts without peer-reviewed corroboration. Any one of these could be noise. Several together would merit closer scrutiny. How should a thoughtful public consume prophetic claims tied to these signposts? First, separate attribution from assertion. If a reading is attributed to Craig Hamilton Parker or interpreters associate a line with Baba Vanga, treat that as a cultural signal rather than empirical evidence. Second, interrogate contemporaneous data. Are scientists and institutions independently corroborating the mechanism behind the claim? Third, question motives. Many narratives thrive because they generate clicks, followers, or donations. The presence of amplification economies often distorts proportional attention. Fourth, consider the human costs of spreading fear versus sharing verification. Responsible sharing favors verified, contextualized information. And if the prophetic framings ultimately prove false, if the year 2026 passes without any of these dramatic ruptures, what then? The social effect is still real. Prophecy performs an anticipatory function. It spotlights vulnerability. Even false alarms have a value if they catalyze preparation that reduces real-world risk. Conversely, if repetition leads to fatigue, if repeated "this is the year" claims go unfulfilled, public trust in both prophetic voice and institutional warnings may erode, making societies less able to respond when genuine threats arise. That tension between vigilance and skepticism is a civic balancing act. We also need to acknowledge the emotional texture of engaging with these scenarios. Fear is a mobilizer and a paralyzer. Facing the possibility that the things we rely on are fragile can be disorienting. Yet that same apprehension can catalyze constructive action. Better local networks, smarter infrastructure investments, stronger public health systems, and more thoughtful governance of technology. When prophecy scares us into repairing our houses and rebuilding trust, it paradoxically produces benefits. The danger is when fear ossifies into fatalism, or when it becomes an industry that profits from panic. So what do the 10 items taken together actually say about 2026? They do not forecast a single scripted apocalypse. Rather, they form a collage of vulnerabilities and imaginations: sanitary fragility, space weather risk, geological sensitivity, institutional strain, the lure of an off-world exit, algorithmic opacity, and the human hunger for revelation, whether extraterrestrial or archaeological. The tapestry they create is useful because it forces us to consider interdependence. Our modern world links supply chains, data centers, satellites, and human systems in ways that make localized failures systemic. At the same time, the prophetic imagination, whether dismissed as superstition or read as metaphor, pushes us to ask ethical questions about what we value and how we respond. If you take one practical conclusion from this countdown, let it be this: resilience is social as much as technical. You can harden a transformer or build a satellite shield, but you also need neighbors who know one another, institutions that communicate clearly, and a culture that balances curiosity with evidence. Preparation without paranoia protects dignity. Rumor without verification corrodes it. We began this video with a promise: a list of 10 terrifying prophecies for 2026 that would leave you speechless. Many of the items on that list are indeed chilling because they touch on real sensitivities in the systems that underpin daily life. Yet, terror alone is not the point. The deeper invitation is to watch carefully, demand evidence, cultivate resilience, and push institutions toward transparency and cooperation. Which of these 10 scenarios unsettles you most? Which would change how you live if it came true? Drop a comment below. Tell us which prediction you find most plausible, which you think is pure myth, and why. Share this with someone who loves deep dives into strange predictions, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more countdowns that weigh wonder against evidence. In the meantime, keep asking questions, keep building local connections, and remember, the future that terrifies is often the future that teaches us what we most need to protect.